All right. We are in the post-resurrection appearances. We looked at the women at the tomb last week. Interesting way of doing it. As I mentioned last week, what you're going to hear most often from critics of the faith, it doesn't matter whether they be religious or non-religious, is that in reality this is the Achilles heel for the Christian faith. Because it will be said with absolute, in absolutist tones, with absolute certainty, that it is impossible to harmonize the resurrection accounts. And the argument is, hey, if the central aspect of the Christian faith is the resurrection, then this should be the clearest, easiest, most established aspect of anything we find in the New Testament. And people like Bart Ehrman and others will say, look, there's too many discrepancies, too many contradictions. Now, we mentioned last week that those terms, especially contradiction, have specific meanings in logic. If you study logic, you will encounter, as Professor Callahan has taught logic in the past, you will encounter specific definitions as to what a contradiction would involve. There were syllogisms that we had to work through in Professor Callahan's class, and you could mess up. You'd make a mistake, and in the process, you would you wouldn't get that particular exercise correct. And hopefully, maybe he can confirm for me that it still works that way. In the modern world, they haven't come up with multiple answers to the logical stuff. I didn't know if Common Core had gotten to logic yet or anything like that. So where modus ponens and everything else has gone out the window. So it certainly has in public dialogue, but we're not going to get into that right now. Be that as it may, the real issue for us, and I think for every Christian, and again, this level of discussion of the resurrection accounts probably wasn't overly normative in most Sunday. Well, of course, our Sunday school classes are weird anyways, one way or the other. We all know that. But in generations past, there wouldn't have probably been as much focus upon these issues as there is today, but we now live in a society that is intent upon disbelief, intent upon skepticism, intent upon destroying our faith in God having spoken. And so every one of us, I don't care what we do, I don't care what our calling is, we are called to give an answer for the hope that's within us, and therefore in our day we have to go much deeper than has been gone into in the past. Now, I think if we will allow... Yes, sir?
Historically, criticisms of Christianity are not new either. You have, like, during the Enlightenment.
Well, the first real well-known, nasty, Richard Dawkins-esque critic is Celsus around the time of Origin. So it's been around a while.
So my question was, those earlier critics, pre-20th century critics of Christianity, are they pointing out to the alleged discrepancies?
Post-Enlightenment, yes. And Celsus did as well. So we're not the first generation to do this, but you combine postmodernism with the internet, with everything else, and some of the things we're dealing with are somewhat unique along those lines. Partly because of not having as much information as preceding. We have more information now than preceding generations did, so it's a broader spectrum of things that we have to deal with. So yeah, each criticism is not new, but the incarnations that it takes can sometimes be somewhat new. But all the way back to Celsus, you have this kind of conversation going on, and certainly a discussion of the relationship of the Gospels is nothing new. But the broad spectrum attack, I think, is probably something that's new and means that if we want to be believers who really are active in speaking to our culture, these are things we just simply have to have in the background. And I think a lot of Christians end up sort of backing away because they know they don't really have that bulwark ready to go, and they're a little afraid of being attacked along those lines. So I think if we will be consistent, allow Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, because John's pretty much, well, Mark is gone after the women. I think we've covered the textual critical stuff enough in the past. You know the two longest variants in the New Testament. You know that there's more evidence for the longer ending of Mark than there is for the story of the women caught in adultery. It is definitely an early writing, but there are multiple endings to Mark. You have the short ending; it ends at verse 8. There's an intermediate ending. There's some that mix them together. You have the long ending. And the very fact that you have multiple endings is, to me, the greatest evidence that the 9 through 20 ending that is in the King James and New King James it comes along later. If it had always been there wouldn't have been any reason for the creation of other endings. But while there are similarities with the longer ending and what we have in some of the others, you can see it. It is included in the text here, so you can see it there. But I think we really, after the women leave the tomb, are down to three sources if we're going to be consistent with our looking at textual critical issues and things like that. And that is Matthew, Luke, and John. And while there are similarities, there are also major differences in focus, and I think that's one of the key issues to get hold of. Almost all of the criticisms that are launched against the Gospels at this point are based upon the assumption that they're supposed to be telling the same story. Well, in a very general way, that would be true. They are telling the story of the resurrection, but it's painfully obvious that they are focusing upon specific, extremely limited